The biting wind sliced through the four-block main street like a knife. A woman stepped down from the freight wagon. Her shoulder bowed under the weight of an old leather bag. The air thickened instantly. Every eye in town locked onto her. She stood motionless in the middle of the street, breath rising in white plumes. Behind her, whispers flared like dry grass catching fire. A woman's sharp voice cut through the cold. A wandering herb woman, dragging that bag again. She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were calm, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 storms. In the distance, a tall man leaned against the feed store post, silent, unsmiling, watching her. His hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. The wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls. Footsteps slowed, and in that frozen moment, the whole town of Asheville seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something inevitable to break. The town of Asheville had a smell, coal smoke, pine resin, something sour underneath. Like old decisions left too long in the cold, Rosalie noticed it the moment she stepped off the freight wagon. She always noticed things like that. Smells. The way a town held its body when a stranger walked in. The particular angle of people's shoulders when they were deciding something about you before you'd opened your mouth. This town pulled its shoulders up. She was used to that. She adjusted the strap of her bag, leather, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Heavy. Always heavy. People were always surprised by how much she carried. A woman like her, they said. With a bag that size, a woman like her. She had heard that phrase in 11 towns now. Sometimes 12, depending on how you counted the one where she'd only stayed 4 days before the weather closed the road. She knew what it meant. It meant, we have already decided something about you. We decided it when you came around the corner. We decided it before you spoke. We decided it from the weight of you, and the way you move, and the bag on your shoulder, and the fact that you are here alone, and we do not know why. She knew what it meant, and she kept walking anyway, because that was the only answer she had ever found that worked. Main Street in Asheville was exactly 4 blocks long. She counted them the way she always counted the blocks of a new town. Not from anxiety, from habit, from the need to know the shape of a place, before the place knew the shape of her. Fee store. Hardware with a hand-painted sign. Dry goods. A boarding house with 2 rocking chairs on the porch that nobody was sitting in because it was November and cold. A church at the far end with its doors shut against the wind. It was Tuesday morning, which meant people were out, which meant people were watching. She felt it before she heard it. Not quiet exactly. More like everyone in the street holding their breath at the same time. Waiting for a better look before they decided anything. She kept walking, and then Constance Beaumont opened her mouth. Constance was standing outside the dry goods store with 2 other women. She had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since arranged itself into something more useful. Sharp around the edges, watchful. The face of a woman who had decided at some point that influence was more reliable than warmth, and had not second-guessed the decision since. She spoke loud enough to reach the feed store. Well, just that word first. One word. The way a person clears a room before they start the real performance. Look at what the freight wagon brought in. One of the women beside her laughed. Soft, polite. The kind of laugh that says, I'm with you, without quite saying I'll answer for this later. Rosalie kept walking. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't give them the satisfaction of watching you recalibrate. A woman traveling alone, Constance continued. Louder now, finding her range, finding her audience, with a bag that size. You know what that usually means, she paused. Let it hang in the cold air. Either she's running from something, or she's selling something nobody needs. More laughter. Not just the 2 women now. A man near the hardware store who wasn't even paying full attention but laughed, because it was the social thing to do. A boy on the porch steps who didn't fully understand the joke, but understood the shape of it. Rosalie stopped, not because she was hurt. She had stopped being hurt by things like this around 19. You run out of a particular kind of hurt eventually, like a well that goes dry. You go back to it expecting water and find only the sound of your bucket hitting stone. She stopped because she needed to get her bearings. Figure out which building was the boarding house. Figure out if there was a boarding house at all, or if she'd be sleeping in the church porch again, the way she had in Delwood 3 winters ago. She's one of those herb women, Constance said. Her voice had found its best carrying register now, the one that reached all 4 blocks. You know the type, wander town to town with their little bottles and their big promises. A pause, a breath. For effect, my cousin had one of them come through Halston, sold her something for her joints. Joints got worse, not better. Charged her 60 cents for the privilege. Genuine laughter now. Rosalie turned her head slowly and looked at Constance. Constance looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Rosalie turned forward and kept walking, because there was nothing to say, because she had learned a long time ago that the best answer to certain kinds of people was to move through them the way weather moves. Like a front coming in off the mountains, uninterested, unaltered. Present and then gone, leaving the air changed in its wake. She was 26 years old. She had been standing in streets like this one since she was 14. She knew how to wait. The man leaning against the post outside the feed store. She noticed him the first time she passed. Hard not to. He was not a man who disappeared into his surroundings, not because he was loud or showy, but because of the opposite. He was very still, the particular stillness of someone who had spent enough time outdoors. That stillness had become a natural state. Like the mountains were still. Like the pines on the ridge were still. He was still the way things are still when they are not doing nothing. When they are simply waiting for the right moment to move. She noticed other things. Mulehide boots with the laces knotted twice, because one had broken and been replaced with cord. Functional, not fashionable. A coat that had been oiled recently, not a new coat. A maintained coat, which is a different thing entirely. A knife at his belt with a handle worn smooth from real use. Not worn smooth from display, from work. His hat was wool, heavy and shaped by weather. The trim around the brim was mule deer hide. She knew because she'd spent enough winters in mountain country to recognize the difference between deer hide and elk, between something bought at a trading post and something made by hand, because it needed to hold against real cold. He was watching her. Not the way most people watched her in a new town, that mix of judgment and curiosity she could read from 20 paces without trying. He was watching her the way she watched towns, with a specific kind of attention, careful, methodical. The way you watch something you're trying to correctly understand before you decide what to do about it. When Constance said her piece about herb women, something moved in his jaw. He didn't laugh. She noticed that. She filed it the way she filed everything, without commentary. Just stored it somewhere useful. His eyes moved to her bag, to her hands, to the way she was carrying herself through the street, and then back to her face with an expression she couldn't fully read, but that did not contain the things she'd seen in most faces today. Contempt. It did not contain contempt. She looked away first, not because she was unnerved, because she had a boarding house to find and a town to assess, and she couldn't do either of those things while standing in the street trying to read the face of a man she didn't know. The boarding house had no rooms. She found this out from a boy sweeping the porch. 14 or so. The freight delay had backed up travelers for 3 days, he said. 6 men sleeping 2 to a room already. The owner wasn't taking new names until Thursday at the earliest. Thursday. It was Tuesdays. She stood on the boarding house porch for a moment and did what she always did when a situation needed solving. She went very still, she thought. She had $4.30. Enough for 2 nights somewhere if somewhere existed. She had her bag with everything in it. She had the knowledge that Dr. Alderton was the circuit physician for this region. She'd confirmed this in Millhaven before she left. and that he was currently 3 weeks into a northern run and not expected back until the first snow. Which was why she was here, which was always why she was here, because towns without doctors were towns where people got desperate enough to try a woman with a bag of herbs. She'd built a career on that kind of desperation, on the gap between what a place needed and what it had, on showing up in that gap and being useful enough that they forgot, eventually, to keep looking at her the way Constance Beaumont had looked at her 20 minutes ago. Sometimes they forgot quickly, sometimes they never forgot at all. They just stopped saying it out loud. She was adjusting the strap of her bag and calculating her next move when the shout came from down the street. It wasn't a scream. Screams are panic. Screams are the sound of someone who hasn't yet understood what's happening. This was different. This was a sound that knew exactly what had happened and was trying to summon help faster than the body could manage. Then more voices. 2, 3. Running footsteps on the frozen ground. Then the words, "Boys hurt at the sawmill." "Somebody get the doctor." Rosalie was already moving. The sawmill sat at the eastern edge of town. She covered the distance in less than 2 minutes, walking fast through the cold with her bag against her hip, and her mind already running through what she might find. Blade injury. That was the most common at sawmills. Blades or pinch points or something falling. She thought about what she had. Suturing supplies. Good ones she'd restocked in Millhaven. Antiseptic. Clotting agents. Clean cloth. The small curved needle she preferred for handwork, because the angle of it gave better control. She heard it before she saw anything, not loud. Not a child's wide-open crying. The other kind. The kind that comes from someone who is trying very hard not to and failing in small, controlled bursts. The kind of crying that has dignity in it, that is ashamed of itself even as it happens. The boy was on the packed earth floor near the main saw. 2 men crouched beside him, one holding his arm. One just crouching with the helplessness of someone who has never been in this situation before and is now completely, unavoidably in it. The boy was 14. She would learn his name was Ned. She would learn he worked the mill because his father's back had given out the previous spring and someone had to bring in wages and he was the oldest. The blade had caught 3 fingers on his left hand. Not a clean cut? A tearing, catching kind of damage? In some ways worse than clean, in some ways better, and either way something that needed attention in the next 10 minutes. She registered all of this in approximately 4 seconds. "Someone get Alderton," one of the men was saying, looking around the room with the expression of someone hoping a solution will appear if they look hard enough. "Alderton's been gone since October," said a voice from the doorway. A boy 11 or 12 who had followed the noise. Children always followed noise. "My pa says he won't be back." "I know," Rosalie said. She was already putting her bag on the nearest flat surface, already opening it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this in bad light, in worse conditions, in rooms far less equipped than this one. The room went quiet, not silent. Ned was still making his sounds, and the cold was still coming through the open walls, and the saw was still ticking as it slowed. But the adults in the doorway, and there were adults in the doorway now, drawn by the shouts, went, still in a particular way, the way people go still when they don't know what they're watching yet. "When the jury's still out, I need a lamp," Rosalie said, not asking, not requesting, stating the way you state that water flows downhill, brought close, not from across the room. And water, clean water, not mill water, and I need him on a surface that's flat and wide. "The workbench over there." She looked at the men crouching beside Ned. "You," she said to the one holding his arm. "Keep holding exactly like that. Don't adjust your grip. Don't let the arm move." He stared at her. She held his gaze. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to her bag and began pulling what she needed in the order she needed it. Her hands knew where everything lived. She didn't have to look. Needle case. Thread. The small brown bottle, with the white label that she kept wrapped in cloth, because the glass was thinner than she'd like. forceps, scissors, clean folded cloth in 3 sizes. She felt someone move into the space beside her. She looked up, the man from the post outside the feed store. He had come in without her hearing him. People his size usually made noise. This one moved the way the outdoors had taught him to move, with the quietness of someone who had spent years in places where noise had consequences. He looked at Ned. He looked at Rosalie. His face asked, "What do you need?" Not out loud. But clearly, "Can you hold his arm?" she said. "Take over from the other man. Above the elbow. Firm grip, both hands. And if he makes a sound, don't react to it. Don't look at him with pity. Just hold." He was already moving to position before she'd finished the sentence. He knelt beside Ned, in the particular way of a man who kneels with his whole body, not just his legs. Both hands found the boy's arm above the elbow. The grip was immediate and steady. The grip of someone who had worked with frightened animals long enough to know that sometimes you just have to hold on until the fear runs out. Ned looked up at him. The man looked back. "You're going to be all right," he said. His voice was low. Not the performed gentleness of someone trying to sound soothing. Something older than that. More certain. Like a statement of geography. Like, the river runs north. The mountain is behind you. You are going to be all right. Ned's breathing didn't stop being ragged. But it slowed, fractionally. The way breathing slows when something has given you a fixed point to orient to. Rosalie noted this, filed it, went to work. She worked the way she always worked when it mattered. No excess motion. No commentary. No explaining herself to the room, or to the doorway full of people, or to the boy whose sounds she could hear and was consciously setting aside a part of her mind that would deal with them later. A lamp arrived. She adjusted its position without looking up from what her hands were doing. Water came in a bucket. She assessed it. Clean enough. The 2 men moved Ned to the workbench, with directions she gave without looking at them. The work was not clean, never was. It was specific. It was demanding. It required the kind of concentration that collapses everything else in the room. The cold, the smell of cut pine and copper, the crowd at the door, into a single narrow channel of what needs to happen right now. One thing, then the next thing. Then the thing after that. She was aware of Garrett the whole time, not distracted by him. Aware. He held without moving. When Ned's body tensed against the pain, he absorbed it without flinching, the way a good hitching post absorbs the pull of a frightened horse. When Ned made a sound, the man said something low that Rosalie couldn't fully hear. Once Ned said something back. Brief, barely audible. But he said it. She kept working. She could feel the doorway. She knew how many people were standing in it. She'd learned to feel crowds without looking at them. The pressure of them, the collective held breath. Those people had been laughing 20 minutes ago. She was aware of this. She did not let it change what her hands were doing. 15 minutes, 20. She saved what could be saved. 2 fingers intact. The third was compromised but not lost. Enough remained that in time, with proper care, Ned would have use of it. Not perfectly, but use. She wrapped the hand with a firmness that is also a kind of reassurance. The wrapping that says without words, "This is contained. This is held. This will not come apart on you." Then she sat back on her heels, looked at her work, looked at Ned. The boy came back to himself slowly. You could see it happening. The way consciousness returns when pain has sent a person somewhere else. Not all at once, piece by piece. Like a room being lit 1 lamp at a time. He looked at his hand, then he looked at Rosalie. "You'll keep it," she said 3 words. Just those. His eyes went wet. He pressed his lips together hard and looked up at the ceiling because he was 14 and the doorway was full of people. And he was absolutely not going to cry in front of them. The man holding his arm didn't say anything. He put his other hand on the boy's shoulder and kept it there, solid and present, until the boy's jaw unclenched, and his breathing steadied, and he came the rest of the way back. The crowd dispersed slowly. People do that after a crisis. They drift the way people do when what they saw wasn't what they came to see. When the thing that happened doesn't fit the shape they'd made for it. What they expected and what happened were different shapes. And the difference requires processing. Constance Beaumont had been in the doorway. Rosalie had felt her there for the last 10 minutes. That specific quality of attention. The watchful kind, the kind that is recalibrating. She said nothing when she left. And that, the nothing, was its own kind of thing. Rosalie began repacking her bag. Every tool returned to its exact position. This was not compulsion. This was practicality. The practicality of someone who sometimes had to find things in complete darkness, in moving wagons, in rooms where there was no time to search. The needle case behind the suturing thread. Tincture bottles wrapped in cloth, heaviest at the bottom so the bag balanced on the shoulder correctly. Forceps. Probe. The small folding scissors that had belonged to Ruth Harbison and that she had sharpened herself, at least 40 times in the 4 years since. She was aware that the man was still in the room. He had released Ned's arm once the boy was stable, had stepped back, given her space. But he hadn't left. He stood near the workbench with his hat in his hands. The same hat, the same mule deer trim, and he was looking at nothing in particular, in the way of someone who is thinking. She finished with the bag. "Stewed, you did the right thing," he said. Clearing the room, she looked at him. "I didn't," she said. "No," he said, "I did." But it was the right thing. She considered this. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, turned his hat in his hands. "Boarding house has no rooms," he said. "I know. I was told. Freight wagons held up north of Reedy Pass. 3 days at least, maybe more." He looked at the hat, not at her. Then back up. "Ranch is 2 miles up the north slope. There's a back room off the kitchen. Stove. Cot. Its own door outside," he said it. The way a man says something he's already decided is right, and doesn't feel the need to ornament. "You can stay there until Alderton comes through." She looked at him. He looked back. No discomfort in it. No agenda she could read. Just the offer sitting there, plain and practical as a fence post. "I don't know your name," she said. "Garrett Hale." "Rosalie Voss." He nodded once. Put his hat on. "Horse is at the rail when you're ready." The north slope, the road climbed fast once they left the edge of town. This was not the gradual rise of foothills that apologized for themselves. This was mountain terrain that made no accommodations. The road was frozen hard and rough from a week of melt-freeze cycles. On either side, the pines grew thick and old and close. Not the decorative pines of lower elevation, but the serious ones. The ones that had been standing through hard winters for 100 years, and had the character to show for it. The cold came off the ridge, like something with intention. Not the polite cold of early November in valley country. This was the real cold, the kind that arrives at elevation before it arrives anywhere else. The kind that strips the last color out of the late afternoon light. The pale gold of the high grass, the brown of the frozen trail, faster than you're ready for it to go. She rode behind Garrett on Sable, her bag across her lap, both hands on the leather of the bag, because it gave her something to hold, and because the horse moved in a rolling way that required minor adjustments, and she preferred to be ready for them. She noticed things about him from behind, the way you notice things about people when they can't see you looking. He sat on a horse the way people sit when riding is as ordinary as walking. Not performing it, not thinking about it, just doing it, with an ease in the hips and the shoulders that came from years of doing nothing else. The mountains had made him that way, probably. Or he'd come to the mountains because he was already that kind of man. She couldn't tell which, yet the coat up, close. The mule deer trim she'd noticed from the street. She could see now that it had been added by hand, not by a tailor. The stitching was functional, tight, done by someone who needed it to hold against weather more than they needed it to lie flat at the seams. But it was good work, patient work. He smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and something else she couldn't quite name. Something cold and clean. The specific smell of high-altitude air, above where the trees thinned out. The smell of a person who spent real time up there, not just passing through. She looked away from the back of his head and watched the road instead. The light was going fast now, pulling the color out of the pasture fields on either side, the way it does at this latitude in November, without warning, without sentiment, just going. Neither of them spoke, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she noticed. The silence between them was not the strained silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other. It was the other kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. She couldn't remember the last time a silence had felt like that. The ranch, it was solid. That was the word that kept occurring to her as they came up the last rise, and she got her first clear view of it, not grand, not trying to be, but solid in the way of things that have been built to last, rather than built to impress. The main house was log construction, squared and notched, with the precision of someone who understood that gaps in the walls were not just discomfort but danger at this elevation. The outbuildings were tight. A barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar with a heavy door and iron hardware that hadn't rusted, which meant someone maintained it. The firewood. She almost smiled at the firewood. It was stacked along the east wall of the house in the way that wood only gets stacked when the person doing it has spent enough cold winters to understand what running short actually costs. Hot, tight, high, covered at the top against the snow. Far more than a man living alone needed for the immediate season. He was prepared for worse than what had come. He was always prepared for worse than what had come. She could tell a lot about a person from their firewood. Garrett unsaddled Sable in the barn while she stood in the yard and looked at the shape of the place against the darkening sky. The ridge above was already in full shadow. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour. She could feel it in her face. He came out of the barn and crossed the yard and didn't ask if she was ready. Just walked to the house and expected she'd follow. She followed. The room behind the kitchen, small, clean. The smallness of something that had been thought about and made to work, not just left small. A cot with a wool blanket. A stove that was not large but was the right size for the space. A window that looked east toward the fence line, and beyond it the open winter pasture, and beyond that the bakes of the ridge, already dark. And a door to the outside, its own door, not through the kitchen, not through the main house. A door to the yard that meant she could come and go without passing through his space. She understood the practicality of it immediately. Less for them to say, he said. She looked at him. He said it without apology or self-congratulation. As a fact, in a 4-block town, a separate entrance meant the story was simpler. Simpler stories gave smaller-minded people less to work with. Yes, she said. Thank you. He crossed to the stove without being asked and began building the fire. She watched him do it, the way she watched people do things they knew how to do. With the particular interest she always had in competence. In the gap between people who had learned a thing and people who had lived inside a thing so long that it lived inside them, he built the fire right. Not fast, not show. Just right. When it caught, he stood and looked at it for a moment to confirm. Then, morning starts early, which she understood to mean someone would be moving before first light, which she understood to mean this was how the ranch ran. Early and without ceremony, he went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. If you need anything from the kitchen, help yourself. And then he was gone, the door closed. His footsteps moved through the kitchen, then across the main floor, then up and then nothing. She stood in the small room and listened to the fire, beginning to work. The stove ticked. The window held the last gray light of the evening for another 30 seconds and then let it go. The blanket on the cot was rough wool, the kind that lasted. She set her bag on the floor beside the cot, carefully, in the specific way of setting down something you will need to find again in the dark. She sat on the edge of the cot and let out a breath. She hadn't entirely known she was holding. There was a photograph on the kitchen shelf. She found it the next morning when she came through for coffee. A pot on the back of the stove, still warm, with a cup beside it, set there with the particular care of something placed rather than left. She noticed the distinction. A thing left is an accident. A thing placed is a decision. The shelf held books, a lantern, a tin of tobacco that was nearly full, occasional use then, not daily. A small wooden box she didn't investigate, and a photograph in a wooden frame turned to the wall. The frame was facing inward, the back of it toward the room, so that whatever image was in it, pressed against the plaster. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked away. There are things that aren't yours to know. Things that sit in rooms and wait for the person who put them there to decide what to do with them. You learn to recognize this kind of thing. You learn to let it be. She poured her coffee, stewed at the kitchen window, and looked at the frost on the fence posts. It had crystallized overnight into something intricate and temporary. The kind of beauty that exists because it's going to be gone by mid-morning and knows it. She heard his boots on the porch steps before the door opened. He came in from the first work of the morning, hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin. She noted this without comment. Poured his coffee, sat they ate without ceremony. She had found flour and made something simple. He ate without commentary, which she took as neither approval nor the opposite. Just eating. Just the morning doing what mornings did. You sleep all right, he said. After a while. Not right away. She considered the question honestly. Because some questions deserve honest answers even when honest is complicated. Better than I have in a while, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then back at his plate. He nodded once, and didn't pursue it, but something had registered. Some small thing had been received and stored. She could see it in the way he looked back down. Not dismissal, the opposite of dismissal. She picked up her coffee cup, outside the frost was already beginning to soften. Word traveled in Asheville, the way it traveled in every small town she had ever passed through. Low. Fast. Ahead of itself, by midday of the second day, people knew where she was staying. By the morning of the third day, they had found reasons to come to the ranch. First was the old man with the chest. His name was Irwin. She would learn this later. He was 68 and had been carrying a rattle in his lungs since the previous winter, and had been hoping it would sort itself out, the way men of a certain age hope things will sort themselves out, because the alternative is admitting something is wrong. She heard it from across the room when he came through the kitchen door, the particular low creak of congestion sitting deep. The kind that had been sitting there long enough to settle in. She listened with her ear against his back and her eyes closed. Her mentor had taught her this. Close your eyes. Let the sound be the only thing. Don't be in the room. Be in the listening. The rattle was in the lower left. Present but not fixed. Movable, which was good. She gave him something for the congestion. Showed him how to arrange himself when he slept. Elevated slightly, turned to the right, so the fluid would not pool. Told him to walk in the morning if the weather allowed because movement was better medicine than stillness for this kind of thing. He left walking a little straighter than he had arrived. Not because of the medicine, yet. It was too soon for the medicine. Because someone had listened with real attention. The kind that takes its time. A mother came with an infant who had been feverish for 3 days. A man came with a hand wound that had gone hot around the edges. The early warning of something that could become serious if left another week. A girl of 11 came, brought by her grandmother, with an ear infection that had been present. For so long she'd stopped mentioning the pain, because she assumed pain was just part of existing. Rosalie treated each of them in the small room, or at the kitchen table, depending on what was needed. She didn't make more of each encounter than it was. She didn't perform warmth. She didn't feel or certainty she didn't have. She was direct, and she was thorough, and she was honest about what she could and couldn't do. They came because they needed something she had. She understood this. It was always the reason. Not warmth, Not welcome. Need. The pure arithmetic of need. She had something they required. She was there. Transaction. She had stopped minding this a long time ago. She returned to her work after each patient left. Her notes. Her restocking. The careful inventory of what she had and what she would need soon. Garrett observed all of it. He didn't comment on it. He didn't ask questions. But he was present in the way of a person who is paying attention without performing attention. The way certain men watch things. Quietly, from the side. Building an understanding they won't share until they've finished building it. She noticed, and she went on. The end of the second week arrived, not with announcement. Just arrived, the way time arrives, when you're not keeping careful count of it. She woke on a Wednesday morning of the second week and realized she knew the sounds of the ranch. His boots on the porch boards at a specific hour, earlier than she'd have thought, even for a man who worked outdoors. The stove in the main kitchen that ticked twice before it properly caught. The horse in the barn who moved differently when the temperature dropped. A particular shuffle and a long exhaled breath that she'd come to use as her own weather gauge. She knew which step on the porch was loose. She knew that Garrett poured his morning coffee slower than his evening coffee. The way some people are slower at everything in the morning. Not from sleepiness, but from something more deliberate. Like the act of pouring was part of deciding to begin the day, rather than just finding oneself in it. She had not intended to learn these things. She had learned them anyway. That was the thing about staying in a place long enough. The place got into you whether you meant for it to or not. She lay in the early morning dark of the back room and listened to the third stair creak under his weight as he came down. Listened to the stove in the kitchen being coaxed back to life. Smelled the coffee when it started. She looked at the window. The sky beyond the frost-glazed glass was the deep blue of pre-dawn. The ridge above the pasture was a dark shape against a darker sky. She thought about Ruth Harbison, who had found her at age 14 in the little Carver County orphanage and had come back for 3 winters in a row before she'd offered the girl a real place beside her. Ruth, who had taught her everything she knew about plants and about patience and about the particular discipline of keeping your own feelings out of a room where someone else's feelings needed all the space. Ruth, who had died and left her the bag and the books and the knowledge that those 2 things were enough to start with. They had been enough. She had built a life from enough. She got up, dressed, came through to the kitchen. The coffee was on the stove. The cup was on the table. She poured it. Stood. At the window, the frost on the fence posts caught the first gray light and held it. Briefly. Before the morning decided to really begin. She heard the outside door. His boots on the porch. He came in from the barn work, hung his coat, washed his hands, poured his coffee, and sat. And they ate. And the fire worked. And outside the window the light came up over the ridge slowly. And without sentimentality, the way light comes up in mountain country. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once when it finally decides to arrive. And the second week turned into the third, and the ranch kept its rhythms. And Rosalie Voss kept her careful distance from the word that had started very quietly to form itself in the back of her mind. The word that was not useful, the word that was not welcome, the word she hadn't let herself say for a very long time. The third week arrived the way cold arrives at elevation, not gradually, not with warning. Just there one morning, settled in, decided. Rosalie woke on the first morning of the third week and lay still for a moment, listening. The ranch had sounds she knew now. The stove in the main kitchen ticking twice before it caught. Sable in the barn, shifting his weight in the particular way he shifted it when the temperature had dropped overnight. Garrett's boots on the third stair, the loose one, at an hour most people would still call night. She knew these sounds the way you know, the sounds of a place you've been long enough to stop being a stranger in. Which was the problem, because she was supposed to be a stranger here. That was the arrangement. That was the thing she was good at. staying long enough to be useful, leaving before she became anything else. Except the coffee was already on the stove when she came through to the kitchen, the cup already on the table, set there with the same quiet deliberateness as every morning before it. Not an accident. A decision made before she woke up. She stood at the window with her cup and watched the frost on the fence posts, and told herself she was just here until Aldarton came back. She told herself this while knowing, in the particular way, you know things you're not ready to say out loud, that she had stopped counting the days. The patients kept coming. Not in a flood, not dramatically, just steadily. The way water moves through good soil, quietly, consistently, finding every space available to it. Old Irwin came back on the 4th day as she'd asked. His chest was clearer. Not clear. It would take another week at least, but clearer. He reported this with the grudging honesty of a man who had expected to tell her it hadn't worked, and was now mildly inconvenienced by having to admit otherwise. She adjusted the tincture, showed him the new proportion. He left, walked a little faster than last time. A woman named Pearl came with her youngest, 3 years old, too thin, not eating. Rosalie spent 40 minutes with them, asked about the water source, asked about what the child had eaten in the last 2 weeks. Found the answer in the water question, as she'd suspected. A farmhand came with a shoulder that had been dislocated twice in 2 years, and was starting to make sounds it should. She handled each one the same way, direct, thorough, without performance. Garrett moved through all of it the way the ranch moved through weather, without altering, without commentary. He was there in the mornings, when she came through for coffee, gone to the outer work by the time her first patient arrived, back in the evening when the work was done. But he noticed. She knew he noticed. She could feel it the way you feel a tension that is trying to be unobtrusive. The specific quality of someone paying close attention while working very hard not to be caught at it. The way he angled his body when he was near the window and she was working with a patient at the kitchen table. The way he'd stopped asking if she needed anything because he'd learned, by the end of the first week, what she needed before she needed it. Water near the table. The lamp positioned on the left, not the right. The kitchen clear of the extra chairs that had cluttered it when she arrived. He'd done all of this without discussion, without being asked, without, as far as she could tell, expecting anything in recognition of it. It was a Thursday evening in the 3rd week when they sat on the porch bench. She had come out because the room felt small, and her notes felt insufficient, and she needed the open air the way she sometimes needed it. Not for any particular reason, just because indoor spaces pressed on her when she'd been inside them too long. The sky was going deep blue above the ridge, the particular blue of the last 10 minutes of daylight at elevation. Not dark yet, not light. Something in between that didn't last long and was worth watching while it did. She had her coffee. She heard him come around the side of the house, felt him register that she was there, felt him decide, in whatever quiet way he made decisions, to sit. He sat. He had his coffee too. Neither of them spoke for a while. The horse in the barn blew out a long breath, a cold breath. It hung in the air for a moment and then dissolved. "Where'd you learn it?" he said, not quite a question. The way he said most things, as if the answer were expected, and he was simply providing a space for it to arrive. The healing. She looked at the pasture. The dead grass pale in the fading light. "A woman named Ruth," she said. "Over in Carver County." He waited. He was good at waiting, better than most people. Most people filled silences because silence made them uncomfortable. He used silence the way he used everything else, efficiently. For its purpose, she used to come to the orphanage when the children were sick. Rosalie said, "I was 4 when I arrived there. Was 14 when I first followed her." She paused. "She didn't let me help at first, just let me watch. Then after a winter she let me carry the bag. Then after another winter she let me do more than carry it. She died when I was 22. The blue above the ridge was deepening now. A minute less of light every day at this time of year. The day is getting shorter so gradually you only noticed it by measuring against what you remembered. Left me the bag and her books, Rosalie said. It was enough to start with, a long pause. After that I just kept moving, town to town. People need what I know. I go where they need it, she said it plainly. The way you say true things that are also hard things. When you've said them enough times that the hardness has been sanded down to something almost smooth. Almost, Garrett turned his cup in his hands. Must get lonesome, he said. Town to town, she considered that honestly, because the honest answer was complicated, and he had asked honestly. So, you stop noticing after a while, she said. Or you think you do. He looked at her then. Not quickly, not sideways, directly. The way he looked at things when he had decided to stop studying them from the corner of his eye, and actually look. The way you look at something when you've decided you owe it the full weight of your attention. She held it, didn't look away, didn't rearrange her face into something safer. After a moment, he looked back at the ridge. He stood, picked up both cups. Cold's coming in, he said. She rose beside him, and they went inside, and the door closed, and the night settled over the ranch like it had been waiting for permission. The next evening he told her about Nora. Not planned. She could tell it wasn't planned. It came the way things come when they've been sitting inside a person long enough to find their own way out. They were at the kitchen table, supper between them, the fire in the grate doing its quiet work. Outside, the wind had come up off the open country and was pressing at the eaves, with the particular insistence of late November wind at elevation. She had mentioned old Irwin's chest in passing, said she thought he would make it through the winter all right if he kept to the regimen. Garrett looked at his plate, then he said, My wife died 4 winters ago, just that. No preamble, no softening. Fever, he said. Came on fast. I went for Alderton first thing. He paused. Set down his fork. He was 3 days out on his northern circuit. Nobody knew when he'd be back. The fire worked. The wind pressed at the eaves. I sat with her for 3 days, he said. I know this land. I know how to read snow and read wind and read what's coming before it comes. I know how to do most things that need doing up here. A pause. Long enough that she thought he was finished. But I don't know what you know, he said. I had none of what you have. And she died on the 3rd day. He picked up his fork. Looked at his plate. Her name was Nora. Rosalie sat very still. She understood what this was. This was not a man looking for comfort. This was not a man asking for something. This was a man explaining, carefully, precisely, the way he did everything. Why he had stepped off a feed store porch and looked at a stranger with a bag of herbs and not laughed. Why he had held a boy's arm without flinching. Why the cup had been on the table every morning. It was explanation, not request. She understood the difference. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words. She meant them exactly as much as she said them. No more, no less. He nodded once. The same nod he used for many things, the one that meant received, acknowledged. Stored, they finished supper, the fire worked, the wind worked, and neither of them said anything else about Nora that night, which was also the right thing. Roscoe came on a Friday. She heard him before she saw him. His horse on the frozen road had a particular gait. One shoe slightly loose, she would learn later, which he refused to have fixed, because he claimed the horse had gotten used to it. The logic of old men and their old animals. He was 62. Built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing outdoor work that left no room for anything unnecessary. Big through the chest and shoulders. Hands like something you'd find in a geology museum. A face so weathered it had achieved a kind of dignity. White beard, full. The kind that happened when a man stopped caring about what his beard did some years back, and it rewarded him for it. He came through the kitchen door without knocking, which told her he'd been coming through this door without knocking for a long time, and stopped when he saw her. She was at the kitchen table with a patient, the farmhand with the shoulder. She was showing him a positioning exercise with a calm specificity that left no room for argument, Roscoe stood in the doorway, watched for 30 seconds, then went out again. She finished with the farmhand, gave him the paper with the exercises written in the precise small handwriting she used for things patients needed to take home. Watched him leave. Then she went to the window. Roscoe and Garrett were by the woodpile. Not splitting, just standing. Talking in the low, unhurried way of two men who had been talking to each other long enough that they didn't need volume or speed. She couldn't hear them. She wasn't trying to. But she watched for a moment, watched the way Garrett stood differently with Roscoe than he stood with anyone else. A slight loosening, not much, barely visible. But there, the particular ease of a person who is, in this specific company, not having to manage anything. She turned away from the window and went back to her notes. Roscoe stayed for supper. He ate with the appetite of a man who had been somewhere cold and had used up a lot of himself getting back. He talked in a measured way, not verbose, not sparse. Somewhere in the middle that had its own kind of pleasure to it. Stories about the North Ridgeline where he'd been trapping for the last 3 weeks. About a stand of old growth he'd found that he didn't think many people knew about. About a black bear that had been following him at a distance for 2 days, before apparently deciding he wasn't interesting enough to bother. He directed most of it at Garrett. But his eyes went to Rosalie regularly, not intrusively, just checking. The way old people check. The way people who have been alive long enough to know what matters look at things to assess their importance. She ate and listened and contributed when she had something to contribute and didn't when she didn't. After supper, the two men went out to the porch. She stayed at the table with her notes. Through the wall she could hear their voices. Not the words, just the register. Roscoe's voice doing most of the talking. Garrett's voice occasionally, brief. The rhythm of two people who didn't need to warm up before saying the real thing. She turned a page in her notebook, made a note about Irwin's tincture ratio. Through the wall. Roscoe's voice said something that made Garrett go quiet for long enough that she noticed the absence of his voice. She didn't look up. She turned another page. The morning after Roscoe left, she woke to the sound of wind. Real wind. The kind that came down off the high peaks when a front was moving through. Not the persistent evening wind that pressed at the eaves. This was the kind with direction and intention. The kind that found every gap and made it known. She dressed and came through to the kitchen. Garrett was already back from the first work. He was at the table with a cup of coffee and a length of rope he was working on. Not because it needed working on, but because his hands needed something to do while it thought. She had noticed this about him. When something was occupying his mind that he wasn't ready to talk about, he found something for his hands. She poured her coffee, sat across from him. Fence on the north side needs a full day before the hard freeze, he said. How long do we have? Maybe a week. She drank her coffee. Irwin's chest was clearer this morning. I think he'll make it through. He looked up at that, met her eyes. Then looked back down at the rope. She picked up her notes. And the morning went on. The rumor came on a Wednesday in the 4th week. She felt it before she heard it directly, in the way people came or didn't come. Old Irwin didn't appear for his check. The woman named Pearl didn't bring the child back. 2 people who had said they would come by didn't, and the ones who did come were different. Something in the way they looked at her, a slight pulling back, a recalibration happening behind the eyes. She noticed all of this, and said nothing, and worked with the people who came, and did the work that needed doing, and filed the information somewhere she would return to. The specifics arrived on a Thursday. A merchant, Halhas, had come through from Millhaven, with goods for the hardware store. He had talked, as merchants do, because talking is part of what merchants do. They trade in information as readily as in goods, and they don't always examine the quality of what they're carrying. He had mentioned, apparently, that there had been a death in Millhaven, a sick bed death, a woman, and that a traveling healer had been present. By Thursday evening, Ashvale knew. By Friday morning, Constance Beaumont had improved on it. She didn't hear it from Constance. She heard it from the space where patience used to be. The kitchen table was empty that morning, and the morning after. The particular silence of a place that used to have people in it, and now doesn't, has a different quality than ordinary silence. It has shape. It has the outline of what it's missing. She sat with her notes. She wrote things down. She did not defend herself to the empty room. The habit of silence went deep in her, deeper than she sometimes remembered. She had learned early, in the orphanage, in the streets, in 11 towns before this one, that explaining yourself to people who have already decided something rarely works. That the best argument was always the next thing you did, not the last thing they said about you. So she waited, and she worked. And she held the empty room around her and didn't let it change what her hands did. Garrett heard it on a Friday in the feed store. She knew this because he came home differently. Not dramatically differently. Not in any way most people would notice. But she had been at this ranch for almost 4 weeks, and she had learned the sounds and movements of it, and she had learned the sounds and movements of him within it, and she knew. He came through the back door with 3 more armloads of split wood than he usually brought in quick succession, and stacked them with more force than the stacking required. She was at the table with her notes. She didn't look up. He came in, poured coffee, stood at the window with it, the standing at the window posture. The posture of someone who needs to look at something that isn't the room they're in. The quiet held. 1 minute. 2, there's talk, he said. About a woman dying. In Millhaven, she set her pen down, looked at her hands flat on the table. A sickbed death, she said. A sickbed that was already decided before I arrived. She paused. She was in labor. The baby had been turned wrong for longer than anyone had told me. By the time they sent for me, it had been more than a day. She looked at her hands. I stayed the whole night. There was nothing to be done by the time I got there, and nothing to be done after I'd tried everything I had. I stayed anyway, the wind at the window, the fire in the grate, because leaving would have been wrong, she said. Even when there was nothing left to do, Garrett looked at her. She did not look away from her hands. The silence went long. Long enough that she felt the familiar weight of it, the weight of the space where a person either believes you or doesn't, where the verdict assembles itself out of what they know of you and what they've decided to trust. All right, he said. Just that, 2 words. He picked up his coffee and went back to the window, and she sat at the table for a long time after, her hands still, the lamp burning beside her notes. The pen where she had set it down, not reaching for it, not yet, because something had just happened that she needed a moment to hold without immediately moving past it, he had said. All right, not, I believe you, which would have been too much. Not, I'm sure you did your best, which would have been condescending. Not, what really happened, which would have been wrong. Just, all right. The most efficient possible version of, I've heard what you said, and I'm standing on your side of it, and we don't need to say anything else about it. She had never had someone do that for her before. Just stand on her side, without evidence, without requiring her to make her case more fully or more eloquently, or to perform a better version of her own innocence. Just, all right. She sat with that for a long time. Edmund arrived on a Tuesday in the 5th week. She didn't see him come into town. She heard about it from the farmhand with the shoulder, who came by with his exercises completed. This surprised her, and mentioned in passing that a man had ridden in from the south and was asking after a traveling healer named Rosalie. Her hands didn't stop what they were doing, but her mind did. Edmund. The name connected itself immediately to Millhaven, to the woman in the sickbed, to the husband Rosalie had met briefly in those dark hours, a large man, quiet in the way of someone absorbing too much at once, who had sat in the corner of the room and watched her work. He was here. She finished with the farmhand, wrote out the next set of exercises, walked him to the door. Then she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the yard. Garrett was by the barn. He had his back to her. Something in the way he was standing, the very slight change in the set of his shoulders, told her he had already been told, or had already seen. He turned, looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke from that distance, but something moved between them. The look of two people who have not made any formal agreement, and yet are, at this moment, standing together in something, without announcing it. Without requiring the other to acknowledge it out loud, she went to get her coat. They came into town together, not side by side. She walked. He rode Sable at a pace that kept him roughly level with her. Not in front, not as escort. Beside. The distinction mattered, and she registered it without comment. Main Street. Edmund was standing near the feed store, bigger than she remembered from Millhaven. Or maybe grief had made him seem smaller then, and without it, without that particular compression, his actual size was visible again. He saw her. Constance was on the porch of the dry goods. 3 other women nearby. The kind of audience that assembles itself without being invited. Edmund walked toward them. Rosalie stopped. Garrett's horse stopped. And then Edmund did something that nobody, not Rosalie, not Constance, not the 3 women on the porch, had been expecting. He took off his hat. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low. Not steady, not quite, but controlled. The voice of a man who had made a decision about how he was going to conduct himself in this moment, and was holding to it. "I've been trying to find you since September," he said. "I wanted to tell you something." The street was very quiet. "I was in that room," he said, "the whole night. I saw what you did. I saw how hard you worked. I saw that you didn't leave when there was nothing left to do." He stopped. Looked at his hat for a moment. "My Clara. She wasn't alone at the end because of you. She wasn't in the dark by herself, and I didn't understand, that night, how much that was going to matter to me later. But it does." His voice caught slightly. He held it. "I wanted you to know that." Silence. Then, "Thank you." He put his hat back on. He looked at Garrett, a look that was brief and direct. The look of one man to another that carried a full sentence in it. Something like, "You're doing right by her." Something like, "I just needed her to know." He turned, walked back toward the boarding house. The street stayed quiet for a long moment after. Rosalie stood very still. She was aware of Constance on the porch, aware of the 3 other women, aware of the particular quality of the silence that happens when an audience has seen something they didn't anticipate and hasn't yet figured out how to rearrange their understanding of events. She didn't look at any of them. She looked at the space where Edmund had been standing. Then she turned back toward the road, to the ranch. Garrett brought Sable around beside her. She put her hand on the saddle. He moved his boot from the stirrup without being asked, freeing it for her. She put her foot in, swung up, settled with her bag across her lap. They rode. And neither of them said anything for the full 2 miles. And when they got back to the ranch, he unsaddled the horse, and she went to her room and sat on the cot and looked at the wall for a while. And what she was doing was feeling something. Something that didn't have a name she was ready to give it yet. Something that was related to being seen. To someone showing up to say, "I watched you do the right thing, and I needed you to know I saw it." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. She breathed. Outside, the day was doing what days did, getting on with itself. But for once, the indifference didn't quite reach her. She sat with that and breathed. The hard week came at the end of the 5th week, 2 nights, running starting Monday. A birth that was complicated and slow, and that kept her in the Prescott farmhouse from midnight to well past dawn, 2 days in a row. Both mother and child survived. She came home both mornings with the gray, hollowed look of someone who has used up most of themselves and is moving on the last of what's left. Garrett said nothing on the first morning. Just left coffee on the stove and a plate covered with a cloth. Things she could find when she was ready for them, without needing to look. The second morning she came through the kitchen and found the same. coffee, plate, and the stove banked high. The room warmer than it needed to be for just him. Warmer because she was coming back, and she was going to be cold, and someone had thought about that before she arrived. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the plate and the coffee in the stove and did not cry. She was too tired to cry, and also she did not cry easily, and also this specific kindness. This kindness that didn't announce itself or require acknowledgement or need anything from her in return. She was not accustomed to this kind. She ate. Then she went to the back room and lay down, and slept for most of a day. That Friday evening she came home before dark. The first time in a week she had arrived in daylight. She sat in the chair nearest the fire in the main kitchen. The chair she had started sitting in over the past few weeks without being invited to, and without being asked to stop. She sat in it and did not reach for her notes or her bag or anything else. Just sat. The fire was already going. He had banked it before she arrived, though she had not sent word she was coming back early. He had known anyway. She heard him come in from the stockwork, the door, the coat on the hook, the basin. And then he was in the kitchen doorway, and he saw her there, and he paused for exactly 1 second. Then he sat down in the other chair, the one across from hers. He had a length of leather he was working, repairing something. A bridle, probably. He picked it and worked it in particular, quiet way of a man doing something his hands knew, without his attention. The fire worked. The house settled around them. She looked at the fire. He worked the leather. After a while, she didn't know how long, she had stopped tracking. Her eyes grew heavy. The warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the week and the particular safety of the room were doing what warmth and exhaustion do when you finally stop resisting them. Her eyes closed. She was not asleep. Not quite. Just on the edge of it. At the place where the body starts making its own decisions, she felt herself drift. Felt the pull of the chair and the fire and the safety. That word again. That word she kept not letting herself use. And then she stopped feeling it consciously because she was asleep. She didn't know she had moved until she woke briefly, much later, and found that her head was against something solid and warm, his shoulder. She had drifted sideways in the chair, the way exhausted people drift. Slowly, without awareness, the way water moves toward lower ground. Her head was on his shoulder. She registered this, waited for the awkwardness of it. It didn't come. He was very still. She could feel that he was awake, the specific quality of stillness that is choosing to be still rather than simply being still. His breathing was slow and deliberate. He had set down the leather. She could feel that too. He was just sitting, with her weight against him, and doing nothing to change it. She let her eyes close again. She slept. She woke deep in the night. The fire had burned down to coals, orange-red in the grate. The room darker than it had been, but not dark. The kind of dim that firelight makes even when it's almost gone. The other chair was empty. She looked at it. The piece of leather was on the arm of the chair. Left there, she was covered, a blanket. Over her, settled with the care of something done slowly so as not to disturb. The blanket from the chest near the door. She recognized the pattern of it. Wool. Heavy, someone had put it over her while she slept. Had stood over her and looked at her sleeping face, probably, before going. Had made some decision in that moment and carried it away into the dark before the light came. She sat still for a long time. The coals in the fire faded from orange to red, to a deep, pulsing amber. She looked at the empty chair, at the piece of leather on the arm, at the blanket around her. She sat and thought about all the small things, the coffee, the plate kept back, the firewood stacked higher than needed, the horse ready at the door before she came out of a sick room, the outside entrance to her room so the town had less to say, the blanket in the night, all the small things. None of them said anything out loud. All of them said the same thing. She sat with that. For a long time, in the almost dark, in the warmth of a fire, that someone had thought to build high enough that it would still be warm when she woke. in a room that had started, against every intention, to feel like something she didn't have a safe word for yet. Outside, the wind had dropped. The night was still. The frost was building again on the fence posts, intricate and temporary, the way it always did when the temperature fell far enough. And on the north slope above Ashvale, the mountain was dark and patient and old, and it had seen harder things than this. And it had seen them come right. The news came through the postmaster on a Monday morning, a letter, official, territorial seal pressed into the wax. The kind of letter that arrived with its conclusion, already written and didn't require the reader to do anything except to absorb it. Dr. Alderton had accepted a permanent post east of the mountains. A hospital position, salaried, indoors. The kind of work a man takes when he has spent 20 years riding circuits in hard country and has decided, finally, that his body has earned something different. He would not be returning to Ashvale. He would not be returning to any of the towns on his circuit. Rosalie heard about it from the farmhand with the shoulder, who had heard it from the postmaster's wife, who had been standing in the room when her husband read the letter aloud. Because that was what postmasters in four-block towns did, with news that belonged to everyone. They made it everyone's immediately. She was at the kitchen table when she heard it. She set down her pen, looked at the wall. Not with surprise. She had been half expecting something like this since the 5th week. People who took emergency postings east of the mountains rarely came back. The East had hospitals and regular wages, and a bed that stayed in one place. The circuit had frozen roads and unpredictable emergencies, and payment in whatever people could spare, which was sometimes not much. She understood the math of it. She picked her pen back up. Because there were notes to finish. Because the morning's patients would arrive, whether or not the regional medical system had just quietly reorganized itself around them. Because need didn't pause for administrative letters with territorial seals. But she knew what it meant. She knew exactly what came next. Ashvale stood around the news for about a day and a half. People gathered in the forts, store and on the boarding house porch, and in the back of the hardware, where 3 men could talk without being immediately overheard. They talked about what it meant. Who was responsible? Whether anyone was going to write to the territorial office. Whether the territorial office would write back in any meaningful time frame, which most people doubted. These were reasonable conversations. And then, because the first snow was 3 weeks away, and reasonable conversations didn't set bones or break fevers, people got practical, quickly, without a meeting. Without anyone deciding it formally, or posting a notice, or making any kind of announcement. They began bringing things to Rosalie, not tentatively, not with the half-embarrassed circling of the first weeks. Directly, with the directness of people who had stopped performing the pretense of another option, and were done with it. A broken finger, set and wrapped. A farmer who had done it in the barn, and waited 2 days before coming, because he'd been hoping it would sort itself. A chest infection that needed monitoring, the early kind, the kind that could go 2 ways, depending on what you did in the next week. A child's cough that had been present for 3 weeks, and had the particular character of something that wasn't going to resolve on its own. An elderly woman whose wound on her forearm had stopped healing, the way wounds were supposed to heal, one by one, day after day, the kitchen table occupied from morning until late afternoon. Sometimes later, the small room off the kitchen filling and emptying and filling again, with the steady traffic of people who needed something she had. And Garrett moved through all of it, the way the mountain moved through weather. He didn't comment on the number of people, didn't remark on how the kitchen had been converted, didn't register any inconvenience at the constant coming and going through the back of his house. He just adjusted, the way he adjusted to everything, quietly. In advance, the firewood was always stacked higher, on the days the kitchen was full. Because more people meant the door opening and closing more, and the cold getting in more, and the fire needing more to compensate. She noticed this. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The coffee was always on. The horse was always ready, always there, without announcement, without requiring her to notice out loud. The night calls came more often now. The 6th week brought 3 in the first 5 days alone. First one on a Tuesday, 2 in the morning. A knock at her outside door, the separate door, the one that gave the town less to say. She was awake before the second knock. She had always been a light sleeper. The orphanage had made her that way. You learned early to hear things in the dark when the dark didn't always feel safe. She dressed in the dark, packed what she needed from habit, her hands knowing the bag the way her hands knew everything she did constantly. Went out. The cold hit her face like a statement. And Garrett was in the yard. Sable saddled. Both of them. She stopped on the step, looked at him. He looked back. He hadn't said he would do this. Hadn't left her a note. Hadn't made any announcement the previous evening over supper. He had simply anticipated. The way he anticipated things. Quietly and in advance and without requiring acknowledgement of the anticipations, she looked at the horse. At him. At the dark road going down the slope toward town. She put her foot in the stirrup, swung up, and they went and he waited outside, every time. In the cold, in the dark. For however long it took. And when she came out 1 hour, 3 hours. Once, nearly 5, he was there, same position, sable patient beside him. The stillness of a man who had made up his mind and was done making it. They rode back in the dark, the frozen road, the pines. The lights of the ranch through the trees at the top of the slope. She had stopped counting how many times. She had started thinking of it as the way things were, which was, she recognized, its own kind of shift, its own quiet arriving. The 3rd night call of the 2nd week was a birth. Out at the Hennessy farm, 4 miles past the edge of town. She knew the Hennessy's, had seen the wife twice in the past month. A woman in her late 30s, her 3rd child, the pregnancy uncomplicated so far. The complication arrived at 2 in the morning in the way complications arrived. Without warning, without courtesy, without any regard for how far from town the Hennessy farm was, or how frozen the road was, or how long it had been since Rosalie had slept a full night. She worked for 4 hours. It was hard work. The kind that required everything she had. Every piece of knowledge Ruth Harbison had given her, every dark room she had worked in before this one, every time she had kept going past the point where stopping would have been understandable. Mother and child both breathing, both present, both going to be all right. She came out of the Hennessy farmhouse at close to 6 in the morning. The sky was just beginning its consideration of becoming light. That deep gray before the first color. The cold was the coldest part of the night. The hour before dawn when the temperature finds its floor. Garrett was there. Of course he was. Sable standing beside him. Both of them breathing slow clouds into the cold air. Patient. Unhurried. The posture of a man who has been standing in the cold for a long time and has made peace with the standing. She stopped on the bottom porch step and looked at him. He looked at her. And something happened in her chest. Something that didn't have a name she was ready to assign to it. A kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the farmhouse behind her, or the coat she was wearing, or any external source. Just him, there, still there. After all of it, both of them, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. Tired. But something else, too. He nodded, the receiving nod. The one that meant, that's the news that matters. That's what counts? Good, he said one word. But the right one. She came down the step. Put her foot in the stirrup. He brought the horse around. And she swung up and they turned toward the north slope. And riding home in the gray pre-dawn, she thought. She let herself think, for the first time without immediately pulling back from it, that this was what it looked like when someone stayed. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just. Outside the door. In the cold. Every time, she had not known, before, what that felt like from the inside. Now she did. Constance came on a Thursday night, 6th week. 2 in the morning, Rosalie heard the knock and was at her outside door in seconds. The body trained by now to wake fast and move faster. She opened the door. Constance Beaumont was on the step, no coat buttoned, no hat, hair half undone from sleep, eyes that had been crying recently and were currently not, but only by effort, no armor. None of it, just a woman, on a step, frightened in the specific way that strips everything else away and leaves only the thing underneath. Rosalie looked at her. Constance looked back, and whatever she had prepared to say, whatever version of this she had rehearsed on the walk over, whatever approach preserved the most dignity, it didn't arrive. What arrived was simpler, rawer. "Jasper," she said. "My boy. He won't wake properly. Fever since yesterday and I've tried everything She stopped, pressed her lips together. Rosalie was already reaching for her bag. "Where is he?" "My house." "Birch Street, I know it." She turned. Garrett was in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, already looking at her. With the question answered before she asked it, she went out. Constance followed. Garrett got the horse. They moved through the dark streets of Asheville, and Rosalie did not think about anything except Jasper Beaumont and what she was going to find, and what she was going to need when she found it. Jasper was 19. Back bedroom. Tangled in sheets, damp from the fever. Face flushed in the way of a fever that had been building longer than a day. Whatever Constance had said about yesterday, the body didn't lie the way people did. The body showed the truth of how long something had been happening. Longer than yesterday. Treatable. But not comfortably treatable. This required work. She went to work immediately. She sent Constance for cold water and clean cloths. Not to remove her from the room, though that was useful, but because she genuinely needed those things, and because a frightened person with a task was better than a frightened person with nothing to do but stand and expand their own fear into every corner of the room. She checked his temperature, his breathing, his responsiveness, sluggish but present, which was the critical thing. She began. She was aware of Constance throughout, standing near the wall when she was allowed, fetching things when asked, following every instruction, with the complete, desperate compliance of someone who has run out of pride and is now prepared to do anything at all. This was not the Constance of Main Street. This was what was underneath. Rosalie had met this version of people before. Everyone had an underneath. The public version, the authority, the certainty, the armor that came from knowing everyone in a 4-block town and having decided long ago that knowing everyone gave you the right to say certain things was just what sat on top. Underneath was always simpler. Underneath was always just a person. Scared. Hoping. She didn't judge it. She just worked. The fever broke close to 5 in the morning, gradually. The way things resolve when you've addressed them correctly. Not in a dramatic moment, but in a slow easing. The temperature coming down, degree by degree. The breathing settling. The face releasing its held color and returning slowly to something more like its ordinary self. Jasper opened his eyes, looked at Rosalie, looked at his mother, closed his eyes again. The sleep of someone genuinely resting. Rosalie sat back, checked his breathing one more time, checked his temperature with the back of her hand. Then she began to pack her bag, every tool, every bottle, back to its exact position, the same hands, the same order, the same care that had packed this bag in every room before this one, and would pack it in every room after. She was aware of Constance watching. She finished, stood, turned toward the door. "Miss Voss," she stopped, turned. Constance was standing in the middle of the room, not in the corner where she'd been for the last hour, in the middle, which meant she had moved deliberately, which meant this was a decision, not an accident. She looked different at 5 in the morning without the armor. Older, maybe, or just more real. The face of a woman who had been performing something for so long, she had half forgotten. It was a performance and was now, in this room at this hour, not performing anything at all, just standing there. Just a woman whose boy was breathing. "Thank you," she said. Direct. No audience, no performance. Just the words, meaning exactly what they said. Rosalie looked at her for a moment. "Keep him cool today," she said. "Water when he'll take it. Send for me if the fever returns." She went to the door. Outside, the dark was just beginning to consider becoming something else. The first suggestion of gray in the east. Not light yet. Just the absence of full dark. Garrett was there, Sable beside him. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and he turned the horse toward the north slope. And they rode home through the almost dawn, and she said nothing for the full 4 miles. And he didn't ask. Because some things needed to be carried in silence for a while, before they were ready to be anything else. And he knew this about her now, which was its own kind of thing. Roscoe came back on a Saturday. He didn't explain why he'd come earlier than expected. He appeared at the kitchen door, with his loose-shod horse, and his white beard, and his face that had been reading things correctly for 62 years. And he came in and sat at the table and ate what was on it, and talked about a wolverine he'd tracked for 3 days and ultimately left alone because some things were better respected than caught. After supper, the two men went to the porch. Rosalie cleared the table, washed the plates. Through the wall she heard them, not words. The register of the conversation. Roscoe's voice doing most of the talking at first. The particular rhythm of an older person leading someone somewhere they need to go. Then the balance shifting. Garrett's voice more present, longer. She put the plates away, dried her hands, sat at the table with her notes through the wall. Roscoe's voice went quieter. She still couldn't hear the words clearly, but she heard 3 sentences land, one after another, in the specific way that true things land. Then silence. Long silence. Then Garrett's voice, just a few words, low, then Roscoe again. 1 sentence. She heard this one. Not because he was loud, because the house had gone very still. "Nora's been gone 4 years, Garrett. That woman out there hasn't gone anywhere." Then nothing. For a long time, she turned a page in her notebook, wrote a word, didn't read it back. Later, much later, after Roscoe had gone and the house had settled into its night sounds, she heard Garrett in the kitchen, not doing anything, just in there. She heard him pour coffee. Heard the particular sound of him standing at the window, which she could identify now by the slight creak of the floorboard under his weight in that position, standing at the window. The posture he used when something was occupying his mind that his hands hadn't found a solution to yet. She sat in her room with her notes in her lap and looked at the wall. She thought about what Roscoe might have said. She thought she might know. And she thought about the photograph on the kitchen shelf, still turned into the wall. Still there. Still waiting for whatever it was waiting for. And she thought about what it cost a man like Garrett to say something once he had decided to say it. The care he took. The precision. The way he arranged words like fence posts, set deep, spaced right, built to hold. She thought about all of this, and then she put her notes down and looked at the ceiling, and waited in the particular way she had learned to wait for what was coming. The festival happened on a Saturday, at the end of the 6th week. The last of the season's cattle came down from the high pasture on Friday afternoon. She watched from the kitchen window. The herd moving through the lower gate, steady and slow, and Garrett on Sable at the back of it, with the posture of a man at the end of a long piece of work that has gone correctly. She watched him until the gate closed. Then she went back to her notes. The festival was tradition. Lanterns strung between the posts in the town square. Old Clarence Marsh on fiddle. He had been playing at these things for longer than most people in Asheville could remember and showed no signs of stopping. Tables of food along the east wall. The men in from the outer farms with the looseness of people who have finished a hard season and are ready, for one evening, to put it down and stand up straight. Rosalie dressed in the better of her 2 dresses. Dark blue. She had bought it in Millhaven 2 years ago and had worn it twice since. She put it on and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. She was not beautiful in the way the word was usually deployed. She was 26, and she was heavy, and she had the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, and the face of someone who had been in hard weather, more than was strictly fashionable. But she was here. Holly here. Holly herself, without apology or adjustment. She had worked very hard to be able to say that and mean it. She put on her coat, the square was full, lanterns in the dark, the orange warmth of them against the cold blue of the November night. The fiddle already going. Something quick that had people moving without quite deciding to dance. The smell of wood smoke and cider and cold air, and the smell of a community that had made it through another year and knew it. Rosalie stood at the edge of the lamplight, because that was where she always stood. At the edge, present but not insisting, visible but not quite inside the thing. The place where you could leave if you needed to without making anyone adjust for your departure. 11 towns. 11 variations of this exact position. She was holding her cider, and not thinking about anything in particular, when Garrett came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood, in the lamplight, looking at the square with the expression of a man who has come to a thing because it needed attending to, not because he particularly wanted to be there. She looked at him. He was wearing the good coat, not the daily work coat, the other one, dark wool, reserved for occasions. Still practical, still entirely him. But the good one, an effort had been made. He turned his head and looked at her, and she saw it again. The thing that had been building on his face for 6 weeks. Assembling itself out of morning coffee, and split firewood and outside doors and blankets laid over sleeping women in the night. The thing that had no performance in it, no asking for anything back, plain certain, a long time arriving. Dance with me, he said. Not a question, not quite a command. Something between. An offer with decision already in it. She looked at the square, at the people in it, at the corners where people stood and watched and formed opinions. She looked at Constance Beaumont on the far side. Constance, who had been on her step in the dark, who had said thank you in a quiet room at 5 a.m, who now met Rosalie's eyes across the square and held them, and did not look away, and did not perform anything. Rosalie looked at her for a moment, then she handed Garrett her cup. He took both cups, set them on the table beside him without looking for a surface, just reaching, finding it, setting them down with the ease of someone whose hands knew how to manage things. Without requiring instructions, he offered his hand. She took it, and they walked out into the lamplight together. He was not a graceful dancer here. She had suspected this and was correct. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man thinking about each step before he took it. His feet knew roughly where they were supposed to go, but consulted the rest of him about it more than was elegant. But he was steady, and steady, she had learned, was worth considerably more than graceful. You could trust steady. You could find your rhythm against it. You could lean your weight into it and not worry about being dropped. She found the rhythm of him quickly. Not his rhythm and then hers separately, just the rhythm that existed between them. That had existed, she thought, for longer than this dance, his hand at her waist, firm, her hand in his, and he was looking at her. Not at the crowd, not past her shoulder, at the people watching from the corners of their eyes, not at old Clarence, or the lanterns, or the couples moving around them, at her, with the expression she had been watching arrive for 6 weeks. The one that had been building so gradually she almost missed it. The way you miss snow accumulating on a branch until the branch finally bends under the weight, and you realize it has been building for longer than you knew. Plain certain, not asking for anything, just there. The song ended, they stopped moving. Neither of them stepped back. The fiddle started something livelier. The square reorganized itself around them. People clapping. Someone laughing. Old Clarence finding a reel he particularly liked. They stood in the middle of it, not moving. the world going on around them while they stood still in the center of it. Garrett looked down at her. "Walk with me," he said. They left the light, down the side street, away from the fiddle and the lanterns, into the quieter end of Asheville, where the buildings thinned and stopped and the land began again, where the cold came off the ridge direct and clean, carrying pine and snow and the specific smell of elevation. Hey, they walked without speaking. She could feel him beside her, the size of him, the warmth of him in the cold air, the particular way he moved through the dark, unhurried, certain of his footing, the way he moved through everything. He stopped. She stopped beside him. He looked out at the dark, at the ridge above the town, at the long black shapes of the pines on the slope that was his slope. The land he knew better than he knew most things. She watched his face. She could read it now. Imperfectly. She would probably always read it imperfectly. He was not an easy face. It didn't offer itself readily. There were things in it she suspected she hadn't found yet and might not find for years. But well enough. Well enough to see that he was arranging something, setting it in order with the care of a man who intended to say a thing once and needed it right. She waited, the fiddle, distant now. Something warm and faint drifting down the street from the square. "The town knows it now," he said. A pause. Not because he'd lost the thread. Because he was placing each piece deliberately. "They need what you do." Another pause. "I need what you do too." He looked at her, not the medicine. "I want to be clear about that." She was very still. "I mean the rest of it," he said. "The coffee in the mornings. The way you sit at the table with your notes and read them like they're something worth reading. The way you talk to old Irwin about his chest like it mattered to you. Personally." He paused. "The way you walked into this town and they said what they said and you kept walking. The way you didn't stop. The cold. The dark. The way you've been in that room off my kitchen for 6 weeks," he said. "And it doesn't feel like a room off my kitchen anymore." He held her gaze. Direct. "Without apology, I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Permanent. As my wife. If that's what you'd want, a breath. Not on account of practicality. I want that to be clear." She stood very still, because she needed a moment, not to decide. She had decided. She knew she had decided. She had been deciding, incrementally, without ever quite letting herself see it, for 6 weeks. The morning coffee. The blanket in the night. The horse ready at the door. The 2 words, "all right," said in the kitchen when she needed someone to stand on her side. And he stood without requiring anything of her in return. All the small things, none of them loud. All of them saying the same thing. She had kept the word in a locked room in the back of herself because she didn't trust it yet. Because trust was something she had learned slowly and at real cost. Because she had stood in 11 streets and in none of them had anyone looked at her the way this man was looking at her, right now, not at what she could do. At her, at the part of her that wasn't written in the bag. The first time she could remember that anyone had wanted to know something about her that wasn't about her usefulness. She felt her hand find his in the dark, against his side. She put it there, her hand against his, warm in the cold air, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "Yes," she said, "simple as that. That's what I want." He turned his hand, closed it around hers, slowly, carefully. The way he did things that he intended to keep, and they stood in the cold while the fiddle played on without them, while the lanterns burned in the square and the people danced and old Clarence found another song he liked, while the mountain above them was dark and patient and very old and had seen harder things than this and had seen them come right. Neither of them was in any hurry to go back. They were married 3 weeks later, Wednesday morning. Church steps the sky had cleared overnight and was the blue that only happened at elevation in winter. Deep, sharp, no softness in it. Beautiful because it didn't apologize for what it was. Pine boughs on the church door. Christmas close. The custom here, the minister was brief. Garrett had asked him to be. He was a practical man. The minister, he had been in this town long enough to understand That some people did not need the full weight of ceremony to make a thing real. That some things were already real. That the ceremony was the official acknowledgement of what had happened long before the steps. It was brief, and it was right. More people came than either of them had expected. She registered this from the steps and felt something she didn't immediately name, and then did. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Not at the faces. She knew most of them now. Treated most of them in the past 6 weeks. Knew their chests and their hands, and their children's fevers, and the particular ways their bodies had decided to make things difficult. But that they had come. Put on their good coats on a cold Wednesday morning, for two people who had not 6 weeks ago known each other's names, old Irwin, breathing easier, standing in the back. He had not come for the ceremony so much as to witness. She understood that. There were people who came to things to participate, and people who came to things to be present to the fact that they happened. He was the second kind. She respected that. Pyrrhal was there with the child. The thin child who was less thin now. The child looked at Rosalie with the frank curiosity of a 3-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was something you were supposed to pretend not to do. Rosalie looked back, smiled, small, real. The farmhand was there, shoulder in the exercises still, doing them. He had told her 4 days ago with the specific pride of someone who had expected to stop and hadn't. And Ned near the front, standing straight, his left hand wrapped lightly, healing well. She had checked it 5 days ago. He was holding the church door with his right arm, and he was doing it with the particular dignity of a 14-year-old boy who has decided that this task is his responsibility today and is going to perform it correctly. He looked at her when she came up the steps. She looked at him. He nodded. Once. The nod of someone communicating something they don't have full words for yet, but are not going to let go unacknowledged. She nodded back. Same thing. She had carried her bag to the steps. Of course she had. It went where she went. It had gone where she went since she was 14 years old, and Ruth Harbison had placed it in her hands for the first time, and shown her what it was for and what it asked of the person carrying it. But at the threshold, at the place where the steps met the church door, where inside began, she stopped, set the bag down, slowly, carefully, with the particular care she always used, the care of something you intend to come back to, something you are not leaving, something that will be here when you return, not setting it down to walk away from it, setting it down to go inside, and knowing it would be here after. The people who saw it said nothing, which was the right way to receive it. She stepped over the threshold, the door closed behind her. The minister was brief, and it was done. They came out into the cold afternoon, pine boughs on the door, blue sky, the cold that had been there all morning and was not going anywhere and didn't need to. Garrett's hand at the small of her back, not gripping, not steering, just there. The way you put your hand somewhere when you've decided that's where it belongs now. When the decision has been made and doesn't need to be made again. She walked down the steps, people around them, voices, cold breath rising. The easy warmth of a community that has finished the formal part and is now just being itself, releasing slightly into something more human than ceremony. She was aware of Constance, on the edge of the gathered people, standing with two women, watching with the watching. That was not Main Street in November. Not the watching that announced itself or required the person being watched to do something about it, just watching. Working something out, their eyes met. Constance held it. Then she gave a very small nod. Barely visible. The nod of a person who is not going to say what needs saying out loud but is hoping the nod will carry it. Rosalie received it. Then she turned back to Garrett, and they walked home. The road was the same road, the cold was the same cold. The pines on either side of the north slope were the same pines, and the third stair was still loose, and the frost would be on the fence post in the morning, and the stove would tick twice before it caught, same as always. Same road, Same cold, same ranch. Except she walked through the kitchen door and it was her kitchen now, not in a legal sense only, in the other sense. The one that takes longer to arrive and means more when it does. The sense that is about belonging rather than ownership. About being of a place rather than merely in it. Her kitchen, her fire. Her window with its view of the fence line and the winter pasture running toward the base of the ridge. Her third stair. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at it. All of it. And felt something release inside her. Something she had not known she was holding until the moment it let go. A long-held tension. The kind that becomes so familiar. You stop registering it as tension. Start registering it as just the way things are, until suddenly it isn't there, and the absence of it is so large. You have to stand still for a moment to feel the full size of what's been set down. She breathed, in out. Garrett came in behind her, hung his coat, moved to the stove. She watched it fun. She thought, this is what I said yes to. Not the house, not the ranch, not the kitchen or the fire or the third stair. This. The man who built the fire before she was cold, who held the boy's arm and didn't look away, who said all right when she needed someone to say it, who stood outside every door in the dark and was still there when she came out. This, she went and stood beside him. He looked at her. She looked back. Good day, he said. She considered it honestly. The way she considered everything honestly. Yes, she said. Good day. That evening they sat on the porch bench, the lanterns in the square below still up from the festival. She could see their faint glow from the bench. Could hear, very distantly, the tail end of something. Old Clarence playing the last songs of the evening, for whoever was left her coffee. His coffee, the cold settled and proper and not going anywhere. She didn't mind it. She had spent enough nights in worse cold than this. In rooms without fires. In towns that had nothing warm waiting in them. She knew what worse looked like, which meant she knew precisely what this was. After a while he said, "You all right?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. No qualification, no almost or mostly or more or less. Just yes. He nodded. They sat. The lanterns in the square flickered in the cold air, and old Clarence played one more song, and the mountain above them was dark and patient and very old, and none of that was going to change. And all of it was exactly right. Come spring, Garrett built the room on Main Street, between the hardware and the dry goods. A proper room. He did it himself mostly, the framing, the floor, the window wide enough for good light. Rotzko came for 2 weeks to help with the heavier work, which meant those 2 weeks involved a ratio of talking to building that favored talking, but the framing got done correctly, and that was what mattered. She watched him work on it, from the street sometimes, from inside sometimes, midway through construction, when he let her see the bones of it before the walls went up. The same precision as everything he built, the same thinking before starting, the same care at the joints. Not because anyone was going to see the joints, but because the joints were what held. He built it to last, of course he did. The bag hung on a hook by the door, inside. Where she could reach it without looking. Where it would be every morning when the first patient came, and every night when the last patient left, and every time in between. Still hers. Still Ruth Harbison's before hers. Still carrying what it had always carried, but different now, in a way that was hard to name. She was not the only person carrying it anymore. Not in a practical sense. She still carried it herself, still packed and unpacked it herself, still knew the position of every item in it without looking. But in the other sense, the weight of it was shared, distributed, held differently, which made it neither lighter nor heavier. Just different, better, maybe. If she was being honest, she was trying to be more honest. About things like this, the good things. The things she'd spent so long not letting herself settle into, that she had nearly missed how good they were. She was working on that. Constance passed the room sometimes on her way to the dry goods. She never stopped, never came inside, never performed warmth she didn't have, but sometimes she paused, for exactly 1 second, at the window, And sometimes if Rosalie was at the window herself, their eyes met, and Constance would give the small nod, the same one from the church steps, the one that carried what couldn't be said out loud, and Rosalie would receive it, and they would both go on, which, in a four-block town, carried almost as far as an apology. And it was enough. She worked, Garrett worked. The seasons moved through the valley and up the slope, and across the pasture in the way. Seasons move in mountain country, without sentimentality, without hesitation, each one arriving fully and leaving completely. Summer. The pasture green after the snowmelt, green the way things are, green after a long white. The ridge losing its snow cap gradually through June and July. The long days that lasted until 9 in the evening and made it hard to stop working because the light kept going. Fall. The cattle coming down from the high pasture. The festival lanterns. The first frost on the fence post that she saw through the kitchen window in the early morning, and that she stopped to look at now, every time, because she had learned, was still learning, to stop for the things that were worth stopping for. And winter again, the real cold, the settling in kind, the kind that required forethought and preparation and everything done properly, because the margin for error was small. He was good at forethought. She was getting better at letting herself be thought for, at accepting the coffee without needing to have made it herself, at coming home to a fire already going and feeling, not strange about it, not guilty, not like she needed to immediately do something to earn it, just grateful, warmly, simply, genuinely grateful. This was harder than it sounded, for someone who had spent 26 years being useful as a way of being welcome, being necessary as a way of being accepted, using her competence as the price of admission to every room she had ever stood in. Learning to be in a room without paying for it was harder than any medicine she had ever learned. She was learning it. The seasons moved, and the porch bench held them both, sometimes in the evenings. That was enough, and outside the window of the small room on Main Street. On quiet afternoons in all seasons, you could hear the livery horses in the pen 2 streets over, the sound carrying clean and clear in the cold air, or in the summer air, or in the spring air with the snowmelt smell, and the birds coming back to the ridge, always carrying, always clear, a good sound, a sound to work to, a sound that meant, you are here. This is the place. This is the one you found, and it found you back, and you stayed, and it kept you, and that is the whole of it. That is the whole of it. And that was the story of Rosalie and Garrett, the woman they called useless, and the mountain man who saw her hands and knew better before he knew anything else, and the town of Asheville, which learned, imperfectly, slowly, in the way all small things learn large things, that what a person carries matters more than how they look carrying it, that useful and known are not the same thing, that staying is not the same as being trapped, that home is not a place you're born into. Sometimes it's a place you walk into on a cold Tuesday morning, with a heavy bag and a quiet face, and nowhere to sleep, and someone is leaning against a post outside the feed store, and he doesn't laugh. And everything else is what comes after.